Thank you very much, and really a joy to be here. I've had the pleasure and the privilege of accompanying the MFA a little bit on its journey to bring Judaica into this museum, and what has been accomplished in a very short time is nothing short of miraculous. I want to congratulate, above all, Simona, and there are also many other visionaries and donors who made this gallery and so many remarkable acquisitions possible. Now, my assignment today is, roughly speaking, to summarize the whole history of Jews in America while standing on one foot. It calls to mind an experience that I had almost 50 years ago when I first became interested in this history. I mentioned my interest to a very distinguished scholar at a famous rabbinical seminary. He was absolutely appalled. "American Jewish history," he growled at me. "I'll tell you all you need to know about American Jewish history. The Jews came to America, they abandoned their faith, they began to live like Gentiles, and after a generation or two, they intermarried and disappeared. That," he was going to give it to me on one foot, "is American Jewish history. All the rest is commentary. Don't waste your time," he said. "Go and study Talmud." As you can see, I did not take that great sage's advice, but I've remembered the analysis, for it really reflects a long-standing fear, hundreds of years old, that Judaism in America is doomed and that it cannot survive in this environment of religious freedom and church-state separation. Here, religion is voluntary. Diversity is the norm. Everyone can choose their own synagogue, their own rabbi, their own brand of Judaism, or no Judaism. And many, you didn't have to be a rabbinical school professor to assume that Judaism would not be able to meet those challenges. But really, as the history of American Jews, and actually many of the items in this museum now demonstrate, the history of Jews in America is a response to that fear that Judaism in the New World will just wither away. Over and over again, one finds that Jews in America rose to meet the challenges, internal and external, that threatened Jewish continuity, sometimes paradoxically by promoting radical discontinuities. And what we see, and what you can actually see in the Judaic gallery, is how Jews reinvent Judaism in an attempt to make it more appealing, more meaningful, more sensitive to the concerns of the day. Now, they didn't always succeed, but the story that I want to tell this afternoon is not a story of linear descent of people who came as Orthodox immigrants and ended up hiding their origins. It is instead a much more dynamic story of people struggling to be Americans and Jews. Yes, it's a story of people who lose their faith, but it's also a story of people who regain their faith. A story of assimilation and a story of revitalization. Now, I'm going to have to be somewhat selective in telling this story, but the first question that you probably have is, when does it begin? My teacher, the great American Jewish historian Jacob Rader Marcus, used to warn that it's futile to search for the first American Jew anywhere, because there was another Jew who was there before, and that's quite sage wisdom. For a long time, we dated the first Jews to the time of Governor Peter Stuyvesant. I'll come to him in a minute, but we now know that there was a Jewish metallurgist and mining engineer named Joachim Gansa, who had actually been at Roanoke, that failed colony, back in 1585. And then there were a few other intrepid merchants bent upon trade who made brief stops at American ports. Some of you may know that one of them stopped here in Boston. Solomon Franco the Jew arrived in Boston in 1649, and the city fathers gave him 10 weeks to get out of town. We also know there were various secret Jews, conversos, who practiced in the south and the southwest, but no community of any size was established until 1654. That's kind of the magic date that we use, because community is absolutely essential to Jewish life and continuity. Many of the objects that you'll see in the new gallery, they require community to worship, and so on. And so 1654, the date of the first community, seems to me still an appropriate date. Now, the Jews who came to, quote, live and reside in 1654 were mostly Sephardic Jews. They were former crypto-Jews, secret Jews. The popular word is Marranos. They had returned to Judaism under the Dutch. They had then gone to settle in the Dutch colony of Recife in Brazil, Recife. For about 20 years, that was the most important Jewish community in the New World. In 1654, Recife fell to Portugal. The Inquisition returned, and both Jews, and we should remember Protestants, were given 3 months to leave. I always tell my students that Jewish history teaches an important lesson here. If they give you 3 months to leave, take the hint. Those Jews subsequently scattered. Most went back to Holland. Some went to other Caribbean communities, Curacao, Suriname, Jamaica, Barbados. A small group of Jews, the traditional number is 23, made their way to the furthest reaches of the Dutch New World and landed in September of 1654 in the port of New Amsterdam. So we're coming to an anniversary, 370 years. Peter Stuyvesant, the Dutch governor of New Amsterdam, was by no means pleased at the Jews' arrival. He believed that New Amsterdam was already too full of religious dissenters, and he considered the Jews were even worse. Deceitful, repugnant, hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ, he called them. He wanted those Jews expelled, and then he said a very important thing, very significant. Giving them, meaning the Jews, liberty, we kept, sorry, I didn't realize I'm not using this right. Giving them liberty, we cannot refuse the Lutherans and the Papists, meaning Catholics. So there goes the neighborhood. You let the Jews in, pretty soon you'll have Lutherans and Catholics. But really, the reason I highlight this sentence is because it reminds us that decisions made concerning the Jews, Stuyvesant knew they would serve as precedent and determine, really, the colony's religious character. They would determine what would happen in New Amsterdam today, New York. And that's very important because it's a reminder that in the New World, not only in the New World, but in the New World, the fate of Jews was frequently tied in with that of other religious dissenters. It's not accident that in this museum you find the magnificent Myers finials in Newport. And you had a significant Jewish community in Newport, Rhode Island. Jews were comfortable there because it was a community of religious dissenters, full of Baptists and other people who'd been expelled from Boston. From the very beginning until today, Jews were never the only outgroup in America. There are all sorts of other exotic, persecuted religions here, although it is worth remembering, and we often forget it, that for most of American history, Jews have been this country's most important non-Christian faith. Now, it's also important to know that the Dutch authorities, who suddenly were forced to decide, to choose between their economic interests and their religious sensibilities. The economic interest is to keep the Jews, religious sensibilities is to follow Stuyvesant and expel them. They voted with their pocketbooks and allowed the Jews to remain. That's one of the signs of modernity. The usefulness of Jews, the fact that they could help to enrich the colonies. They were merchants and traders. That was much more important to the Dutch in the end than the faith of those Jews. And so it was that the Dutch authorities ordered Stuyvesant to permit Jews to travel, trade, live, and remain, provided that the poor among them shall not become a burden to the company or to the community, but be supported by their own nation. So what we see is Jews are part of the larger society and also apart from it. They lived, interacted, and traded with other colonists, and you can actually see that in the museum gallery, where Jews are part of the colonial period, but they're also part of their own nation. And you can see that in a separate gallery set aside for Jewish objects, because they are at the same time different from Christians. Part of, apart from, just as they are portrayed here. So much for colonial Jews. Let's move on to the, not great, but you'll get the idea, to the American Revolution. Jews number about 1,500, and most are situated in port cities from south to north: Savannah, Charleston, Philadelphia, New York, and Newport. Those dates are roughly when synagogues are established, not when communities are established. Boston is not on that list, and that's because you did not have a colonial community in Boston. Boston is the most homogeneous of the important American colonies, and they didn't like outsiders. And the port of Boston was not doing the same kind of Atlantic trading, and so the Jews go to the free port then, which was in Newport. In each of these port cities, Jewish life was organized around a synagogue, and that synagogue is denominated as a kahal kadosh, a holy congregation, an all-embracing synagogue community. To this day, some of those synagogues have the letters KK in front of them. It doesn't stand for Ku Klux. It stands for Kahal Kadosh, or Kehillah Kadosha, holy congregation. And when you're in the Judaic gallery, you'll see why. Holiness is really central to many of those objects. And this community, which is heir to the medieval organized Jewish community known as the Kehillah, is absolutely monopolistic. It's going to control all aspects of Jewish religious life, whether it's life cycle events or kosher food or Jewish education. It will discipline those who violate its rules. It will levy assessments on seat holders. This system, one synagogue per community, the synagogue and the community are one and the same, promotes group solidarity and discipline, evokes a sense of tradition and a feeling of kinship towards similarly organized synagogue communities throughout the Jewish world. It enhanced the chances that even these small clusters of Jews, remote from the wellsprings of Jewish learning, could survive from one generation to the next. Now, freedom and democracy did not loom large among the values espoused by the synagogue community. I suspect that Jews of that time would have viewed such revolutionary ideas as dangerous to Judaism and to the welfare of the Jewish community as a whole. But of course, these revolutionary ideas are going to be legitimated by the American Revolution, which enshrined freedom and democracy into law. The majority of Jews, not all, the majority of Jews supported the revolution. Some also shed blood on the field of battle. And the question in the face of the revolution and following that, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, was whether Judaism could ultimately be reconciled with freedom and democracy, especially in the area of religion. This is the perennial question. Can Judaism in America survive? Or specifically, can Judaism, under these new post-revolutionary conditions, still maintain the traditional structure that bound Jews together, promoted group survival, even as it accommodates new political and cultural and religious realities? That's the challenge. Jews really grappled with that problem for decades. That's really the history of the first 50 years, and then perhaps you could say until today. But so I'm not going to be able to go into details. But in one example is when an independent-minded member of the Jewish community, his name was Joseph Abrahams, he decides he's going to go into business for himself and sell kosher meat as an independent. Of course, the synagogue, which had a monopoly, was absolutely horrified. What a threat to the Jewish community. And they even tried to persuade New York to pass a law making it illegal for an individual to do that. But ultimately, the friends of that independent-minded ritual slaughterer pointed out that it's a free country. And all of those rules were expunged, and suddenly you had multiple ways and places where you could obtain kosher food, meaning that the authority of the synagogue was diminished. Similarly, it is in this period that we begin to see, first in Charleston and New York and then elsewhere, synagogues breaking away, young groups of Jews dissatisfied with Judaism as it is practiced in these synagogue communities. They break away from what they call established synagogues, and they found new congregations. In Charleston, it's probably the synagogue with the longest name in all of American Jewish history, but the name at least will give you a sense of their thinking. The Reformed Society of Israelites for promoting true principles of Judaism according to its purity and spirit. And this, of course, is a forerunner of Reform Judaism. In New York, the story is a little different, but the new congregation, B'nai Jeshurun, it still exists, known as BJ, wanted to be less formal, less elitist than the synagogue they broke away from. But the point is that during this period, under the influence of evolving American culture, we see Jews overthrowing the monolithic synagogue community that had once dominated Jewish life and creating a new American Judaism that is more democratic and free and diverse and competitive. And certainly American Judaism as we know it was shaped by that revolution. Now, while this was taking place, a different kind of revolution was transforming American Jewish life, and that is massive immigration. Between 1820 and 1860, according to inexact estimates, you can see it here, you roughly move from 3,000 Jews to, say, 150, some would say 200,000 Jews. And by 1877, when there's actually a census, the number is 250,000, meaning in 1880, it's somewhere between those numbers, probably on the larger side. During this period, which is really the lifetime of someone who was 50, 60 years old during this period. The American Jewish population increased at a rate 15 times greater than the nation as a whole. Most of these immigrants came from Central Europe. They came from Bavaria, from Western Prussia, from Posen, and they're part of a much larger stream that is also bringing millions of Protestants and Catholics from Germany and Poland to the new United States, and that's caused by famine and economic dislocation and political discontent. But, and very significant, Jews emigrated at a rate almost 4 times that of their non-Jewish counterparts, and that suggests that they were emigrating for reasons peculiar to themselves, in addition to the reasons I enumerated. And we know that, indeed, well into the 19th century, Jews in Germany and Poland faced severe restrictions on where they could live, what kind of work they could pursue, even in the case of Bavaria, whether or not they could marry. The Bavarians wanted to limit the number of Jews and placed very significant restrictions on who could marry within the Jewish community. So the New World, and what you're looking at here, is a specially printed prayer book for immigrants to America. It actually has the word America. It's printed in Fourth in 1842, and it gives you a sense, if they were printing a special miniature prayer book, that we're talking about a very significant movement of people. The New World represents the promise of freedom and opportunity. Now, the Jewish immigrants who came to America really spread out across the country. Cincinnati at this time became really a Jewish boomtown. West of the Alleghenies, its Jewish population zoomed from a grand total of 16 Jews in 1820 to maybe 10,000 by the Civil War. But by the Civil War, the number of organized Jewish communities with at least one established Jewish institution had jumped to 160, distributed over 31 states and the District of Columbia. Jews moved into every region of the country, including the rapidly developing West. Jews certainly went west with the gold rush, and they also lived in about 1,000 other locations, wherever rivers and roads and railroad tracks took them. Like the bulk of immigrants to America's shores, and it's still true today, they pursued opportunities wherever they found them. Now, of course, the America that Jews came to in this period was in the throes of economic change. A subsistence economy rapidly gave way to a market-driven economy, goods and commodities flowing back and forth across the country, and peddlers of the kind you see here. Peddlers helped to make this great transformation possible, and a totally disproportionate number of these peddlers were immigrant Jews, young people in their teens and 20s who looked at peddling as the first step on an economic ladder to success. Typically, they'd spend a few years selling notions, dry goods, secondhand clothing, cheap jewelry, and the like. They would learn English through these kinds of interactions, and then they try and move on to something better. Often they would come to a community, they'd built up some capital, they would open a store. Now, that meant the Jews fanned out across the country. They, of course, spread the fruits of American commerce to the hinterland. They created new markets for producers. They themselves chased after opportunity, and they carried Judaism to frontier settings, often places where Jews had never been seen before. Initially, the Judaism that developed in these new settings sought to replicate what immigrants had known in their old European homelands. But fear for the long-time survival of Judaism under conditions of American freedom soon resulted in significant changes. Some, like the great Orthodox Jewish leader Isaac Leeser, advocated tradition in an American key. And the painting really gives you a sense of an immigrant who has modernized and Americanized. No beard, and he is dressed like a clergyman of his time would have been. He calls for greater emphasis on Jewish education, on decorum, on aesthetics. He introduces the regular English language sermon, following the pattern of the surrounding churches, but he was most insistent that there should be no deviations from Jewish law. That's one strategy. A second strategy, made famous by the great Reform Jewish leader Isaac Mayer Wise in Cincinnati, presumed that Judaism itself needed to change in order for it to survive. Reformers like Rabbi Wise urged Jews to abandon rituals that seemed incompatible with modernity and to adopt innovations that promised to make Judaism more appealing and spiritually uplifting. Shorter services, vernacular prayers, organ music, mixed seating, meaning mixed gender seating, men and women together and not separated. Still, a third strategy aimed at preserving Judaism actually rejected the synagogue altogether and focused on ties of peoplehood as the unifying element in Jewish life. The idea found its most important institutional expression in the Jewish fraternal organization B'nai B'rith. You can see here its very name, Brit, meaning covenant, sons of the covenant, suggests that ethnic ties between everybody who shares the same covenant are what's important. Synagogues divide Jews, alienate some of them altogether, B'nai B'rith argued. it said that this covenant that bound Jews one to another, regardless of religious ideology, that would bring about the union and harmony in Jewish life. Now, actually, the history of American Judaism is replete with oscillations back and forth among these different strategies. I consider it a kind of checks and balances system, just like in American government. Proponents of each strategy checked the other's excesses, and together, these three strategies, Orthodox, Reform, Peoplehood, together they accomplished what none might have accomplished separately. They kept American Judaism going. But the benefit came at a price. Often, and even to this day, American Jewish religious life has seethed with acrimonious contention, the unseemly specter of Jews battling Jews. Now, with the unification of Germany in 1871, Jewish immigration from Central Europe began to drop, and it is succeeded by a much larger immigration from Eastern Europe that ultimately brought more than 2 million Jews from Russia, Romania, Austro-Hungary to America's shores. Bloody pogroms from 1881 onward sparked many a decision to risk life and fortune in the New World, but they were not really the root cause of the migration. They were the occasion, not the cause. The cause of the migration lay deeper in great overpopulation. The 19th century saw an enormous population rise in, especially in Eastern Europe. That's largely because more children lived, and there was also for Jews oppressive legislation and economic dislocation and forced conscription and wretched poverty and really crushing despair. We'll never be able to make ends meet. All of which was coupled with tales of wondrous opportunity in America and offers of help. This is the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. You also saw cut-rate tickets on the new steamships, which made it much cheaper and safer to come to the New World. And they began plying the Atlantic. Immigration was halted during World War I. It resumed briefly following the war and is then drastically restricted by the restrictive quota legislation of 1924, which cut the flow of Jewish immigration to the United States down to a trickle. The bulk of East European Jews either settled in or passed through New York City. They mushroomed its Jewish population from about 80,000 in the 1870s to almost 1.4 million in 1915. At that point, Jews were about 28% of the city's total population. East European Jews also settled here in Boston in significant numbers, and also in hundreds of other communities, from Maine to California, sometimes on their own initiative, and sometimes thanks to ambitious efforts to distribute Jews across the country. This one is Galveston, Texas, and this is from the Galveston plan to move Jews, not so much to Galveston, but to the middle part of the country through the port of Galveston. Jews, for the most part, or at least many of them, became factory workers in the United States, the clothing factories, cigar factories, and the like. Others were street peddlers. Jews, East European Jews, pioneered trade unionism and industrial relations, and in order to support one another in the New World, we see them developing lodges and centers of gathering and creating a very vibrant publishing, a very vibrant culture with books in Yiddish and Hebrew, newspapers, theaters, later films, educational institutions, and more. And in a way, when you see the objects created, the great artistic object, they happen to be religious objects in the gallery, but that is part of the great migration of Jewish culture from the Old World to the New World. The devastation of World War I actually helped to draw all of the different segments of American Jewry together. The need in Europe was very great. Jews, even if they had fought with one another before, between old immigrants and new immigrants, now felt a deep feeling of kinship towards those suffering abroad and in contributing to feed, clothe, and house the suffering Jews of Europe and Palestine. American Jews found a collective mission. And indeed, this mission is visibly demonstrated in the establishment and activities of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. It still exists, the JDC it's often called. It was founded in 1914 as a direct result of World War I. Naturally, they thought it would only be a temporary organization, but here we are 110 years later, and it is still doing a very important work linking Jews to fellow Jews across the ocean who are in need. It is also at this point that Zionism becomes a significant force in American Jewish life, just as the problems facing Europe's Jews multiplied and immigration restrictions made clear that Jews wouldn't be able to come, or at least the vast majority wouldn't be able to come to the United States. And this is a very important development, the conversion to Zionism of the nationally famous people's lawyer. He's the future Supreme Court Justice, Louis Brandeis. He becomes persuaded that the Zionist movement will solve this problem, and he assumes the chairmanship of the Provisional Executive Committee for General Zionist Affairs. He assumes that chairmanship in 1914. That becomes a prime catalyst for Zionism's growth, and his personal persona and mystique and charm and prestige and sincerity and passion. You can tell I teach at Brandeis University. But really the thrill of being part of a movement that he headed led Zionism's ranks as well as its treasury to swell as never before. While it's certainly not a linear growth, Brandeis also plays a very important role in legitimating Zionism as an American movement closely tied to his hero, Woodrow Wilson's ideas about making the world safe for democracy and exporting the American dream outward. In 1917, Zionists and non-Zionists, religionists and secularists joined in the first American Jewish Congress to press for rights of Jews in Europe and to help establish a Jewish national home in Palestine. 1917 is also the year of the Balfour Declaration, which said that the British government favored the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and that's going to be reaffirmed by Woodrow Wilson in 1918. Now, the decades after World War I really present something of a mixed picture. There's a lot to be joyful about. Jews number among the many immigrants and their children who benefit from new opportunities in higher education and from the burst of wartime prosperity and post-war investment. And we see many Jews in these years bounding into the middle class, moving off to live in new and better neighborhoods. This is the beginning of Brookline in this period as a Jewish community, reflecting Jews' improved economic circumstances. And of course, once immigration is limited, the American Jewish community naturally becomes more native-born during this interwar years period, and there is a certain point in the 1930s when the American-born children of immigrants outnumber their parents. And for the first time, really in more than a century, the Jewish community is predominantly native-born. And finally, American Jews came increasingly to feel, as the title of this book shows, feel at home in America during these years. Those born or raised in the United States, and especially those who had fought in World War I, developed an American consciousness and identity. They came to feel both American and Jewish, insisting that they were both at once. So that's the good news. The bad news during the interwar years is that American Jews also had a great deal of apprehension. In response to the post-war Red Scare, fear gripped many Americans, and they lashed out at immigrants, at Bolsheviks, at those not seeking to conform. In 1915, a young Jewish factory superintendent named Leo Frank was lynched in Atlanta amidst a frenzy of anti-Semitism after being falsely accused of the murder of a 13-year-old employee. And there's actually a lot that survives from Leo Frank. What's interesting is that the crowd yelled, "Hang the Jew." They didn't say, "Hang Leo Frank" or "Hang the murderer." It was, "Hang the Jew." Then, beginning in 1920, weekly issues of the Dearborn Independent, which was the very widely distributed newspaper of automaker Henry Ford, it purported to describe an international Jewish conspiracy. Here he called it the world's problem. By the time he produced a book, which he sent to every library in America, it was the world's foremost problem. And he would continue to publicize articles on this topic, many of them influenced by the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, until 1927, when, under intense economic and legal pressure, he apologized, but by then the damage had been done. Then we hit the 1930s and add economic depression to this scalding brew, which exacerbated social tensions throughout the United States and exacerbated anti-Semitism as well, with Hitler rising in Germany and domestic anti-Semites like this man, the radio priest, that was not right. The radio priest, Father Charles Coughlin, who ranted on the airwaves, and we now know, thanks to a recent book, that he was literally funded by the Nazis and was very active here in Boston. There was good reason for American Jews to be nervous. However much they felt at home in America, the question was, did America feel at home with them? Reports of German atrocities against Jews, I have to move a little faster, put this question to the test. About 5% of Americans said that the immigration quota should be changed to accommodate Jewish and other refugees from Nazism. When efforts were made, the Wagner-Rogers bill, to bring children to America, that bill failed in the Senate. Now, America did eventually accept about 200,000 Jewish refugees over a 12-year period, but that's a small fraction of those who might have been saved. About 550,000 Jewish men and women served in the armed forces during World War II. For Jews, World War II was the ultimate synthesis of patriotic allegiance and religious duty. And while there was anti-Semitism in the service, the Central Command tried to promote religious harmony. They wanted people to fight the enemy, not one another. And we see an inclusive interfaith message. Protestant, Catholic, Jew, long before Will Herberg wrote a book with that title.
And these ideas, which begin in the military, are going to be enormously significant in the post-war period. And then, with the destruction of the major European centers, America, in the post-war period, assumes the mantle of diaspora Jewish leadership. It is by far the largest, richest, most important politically Jewish community in the world. And then, with the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, that becomes the spiritual homeland. There is something of a religious revival in post-war America. Jews are part of it. There's a lot of institution building. In suburbia, we see hundreds and hundreds of synagogues being built across the United States, along with other communal institutions. We also see new Jewish communities emerging in places like Miami and Los Angeles, where more Jews are moving, the so-called Sun Belt. And American Judaism is also, there's the Golden Cities, is also strengthened by Holocaust refugees, among them illustrious rabbis and scholars. They survived, they believe, for a transcendent purpose, and they work to fulfill that purpose by strengthening and revitalizing American Jewish religious life. So in the 50s and the 60s, there is abundant focus on universal causes in the Jewish community: world peace, civil rights, interfaith relations. Then as the 60s move on, opposition to the war in Vietnam. Jews play an active role in the early civil rights movement. They lobby for a revised Catholic statement on relations with the Jewish people, what becomes known as Nostra Aetate, and here in Boston, Cardinal Cushing plays a central role in that, and many of them participate too in anti-war demonstrations. But then we see a change in the late 60s. Some see it as a shift from universalism to particularism. Certainly, the Six-Day War in June 1967 marked a critical turning point, changing the way many Jews thought about Israel and themselves. A lot of us imagine that October 7th of this year will be a parallel turning point in the history of the American Jewish community. But in the years following 67, you see the Jewish agenda change, focusing on strengthening Israel and on helping Jews in need, particularly in rescuing the Jews of what was then the Soviet Union. This is the most successful human rights initiative of the entire post-war period. It will eventually bring 1.5 million Jews from the former Soviet Union to Israel, the United States, Western Europe. And we also see some interest on the part of young Jews in revitalizing Judaism in harmony with the countercultural ideas of the day. Now, bringing this to the present, we really see two contradictory trends in American Jewish life, and they're reflected also in the cultural activities of American Jews and in their art and in drama and television. And those two trends are assimilation and revitalization. And really, it's not a matter of predicting which will win out. That's the battle that's waged day by day, community by community, person by person. Today, as in the past, American Jews are often told, as I was told 50 years ago, and others were told in colonial times, the American Revolution, the 19th, the 20th century, that Judaism in America is doomed. Anti-Semitism, assimilation, intermarriage are inevitable. And that may prove true. I continue to worry. I actually think it's very good for members of minority groups to worry. Keeps you from growing complacent. In any case, we're taught that hypochondriacs live a long life. But history, as I hope this somewhat breathless survey indicates, suggests also another possibility, that American Jews will find creative ways, as they so often have in the past, to maintain Jewish life. So with the help of visionary leaders and committed curators and generous philanthropists, it may still be possible for the current vanishing generation of American Jews to be succeeded by another vanishing generation, and then still another. And I close with my favorite line from Shimon Ravidovich, the great Jewish philosopher who began and brought Jewish studies to Brandeis University, who wrote, "A nation dying for thousands of years means a living nation. Our incessant dying means uninterrupted living, rising, standing up, beginning anew. If we are the last, let us be the last as our fathers and forefathers were. Let us prepare the ground for the last Jews who will come after us, and for the last Jews who will rise after them, and so on until the end of days." Thank you very much. So now it's your turn. I left a lot of things out, and I did write a book, and I'd be very glad to address any questions that you may have. And Simona is here, so if you have questions about the gallery, you can ask those questions as well.
We have microphones on either side of the room, so you can just raise your hand high, and we'll come to you.
Thank you. I have two questions. When they first came, when it was just the colonies, I noticed that there were two cities. I think it was Charleston and Savannah. And it makes sense that they would go to New Amsterdam from the Caribbean, but why was it those two cities? And then the second question is, it sounded like there was a lot of movement, merchants and things like that. What about, were they prohibited from owning land, 40 acres and a mule, any of that stuff too? Is that why there was so much movement?
So those are both wonderful questions. Did everybody can hear them? You'll see that if we had a map, which I don't here, Charleston, Savannah have extensive ties with the Caribbean in general, and it's no surprise at all that Jews were part of that, but also for a rather ugly reason. There's slavery, and many
and many of the slaves come in through the Caribbean. And the truth is that that's where the action is. In that period, the Jewish community of Curacao, for example, had more Jews than all of North America combined there. You're absolutely right about mobility, and that is going to be a feature of American Jewish life, I'm tempted to say from the beginning to the present, but certainly in those periods. You're also quite right that unlike in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, there are no restrictions on Jews moving within the United States. And of course, once the Constitution is promulgated, any such restrictions are outlawed under the Constitution. You can't prevent people from moving from one state to another. And that's for different people can follow opportunity. But as merchants and traders, Jews were much more mobile than those who were farmers. And it's very, very common when you look at a Jewish family, say you're doing genealogy, you'll see they themselves lived in different places and different family members lived in different places. Then people got married and moved somewhere else. And historically, Jews moved to all sorts of places in hopes of striking it rich. I've been doing some research on the Jews who moved to the Comstock, which was, a brief moment after the Civil War where silver is discovered in Nevada, and all sorts of places that don't even exist anymore, like Virginia City, turn out to have had Jewish communities because Jews followed in the hopes of striking it rich, and that was certainly part of the lure of America. Thanks, yeah. Other?
First, I'll go back to you.
You have to speak loudly, yeah.
As the reform movement was taking place in the United States, was there also a reform movement in Europe, or was this just mostly in the U.S.?
So I'm not sure I heard every word there, but I think you're asking about the relationship of the reform movement in the United States and the reform movement as it initially develops in Germany and then spreads in Europe. Obviously, they have the same name, and they grow at approximately the same time, but the relationship is complicated. The earliest reformers, many of them seem to have been influenced by their neighbors. Say, Charleston Jews were heavily influenced by the Unitarians in Charleston, and anyone who compares the Reform prayer book of Charleston with the Hamburg famous Reform prayer book will see that they have nothing in common. On the other hand, you begin to see reformers, significant reformers, Isaac Mayer Wise, David Einhorn, and many others coming from Europe to the United States, and they bring Reform Jewish ideas with them and indeed link American Reform to Europe. But there are differences. So, for example, mixed seating, its enemies always called it promiscuous seating. Mixed seating in American synagogues very much was influenced by seating patterns in American churches, which already in colonial America sat men and women together. The articulation came later, but the idea was the family that prays together stays together. They didn't say that until later, but the idea is there because you see mixed seating come in just as work kind of moves away from the home and out into, and people are spending much more time away from home. Anyway, mixed seating is not a feature of German Reform Judaism. Indeed, even the great so-called radical reformer, David Einhorn, was rather shocked when he came and saw men and women sitting together. And of course, the joke was, it's all right, they sit together, but what if the speaker is a bore? Then they may fall asleep, and so, you know. But that was a famous, visible difference between Reform in much of Europe and in America.
Thank you. I have two questions also. First one is, you said that the first Jewish community was in New York City in 1654, I think you said, but the first synagogue was until 1730, I think, according to your map. Did they just meet in each other's homes until, I guess, they gathered enough money to build a synagogue? Question one. Question two, for you, as well as our Judaic curator, I was here for a lecture 10 or 15 years ago when the Judaic curator program was started, and at that time the museum thank you. And at that time the philosophy of the museum was to spread the Judaica items throughout the museum, and there was a really good philosophy to it that was part of the time frame or whatever other things were at that same time frame. But now the museum is changing the philosophy and having a Judaica collection in one area. What accounts for the philosophy or the change of doing that?
So let me talk, and then others have a rebuttal. First of all, I'll answer the first question, which Jews were not permitted to worship publicly under the Dutch and even under the British in the early years. They were allowed to stay as long as it was in due quietness, that's the term used, and that was very much in keeping with even the practice back in Holland. The Dutch believed in freedom of conscience, but freedom of conscience a private right, and there was really a sense of out of sight, out of mind, and so we know that there were Jews who met, but probably, as you imply, in a private home. There are some early records of gatherings, but the Mill Street Synagogue, which is the first building on Mill Street of Shearith Israel, today the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, is 1730. In terms of this museum, and then I'll let Simona correct me, it's not either or. It's both. And it's still both. Go to the Colonial Gallery, don't miss it, because they have those amazing Myers finials, rimonim. And they're linked to Newport or to the colonies, because Myers was linked to the colonies. Myers produced cutlery and cups and all the things that a good silversmith did, and many, many people had them. He produced at least as much, I think, as Paul Revere, and so that's linked to the Colonial. But at the same time,
Jews spend, especially their religious lives, apart. And that part of and apart from is exactly mirrored, and by design, in the museum. You see both, and to this day, that's what it is. Simona, take it from there.
Well, yes, he's right. We're doing both rather than replacing the philosophy which you've correctly described of integrating Jewish works with non-Jewish works from the same period and region. We are integrating, we're still in 14 galleries throughout the museum, and, rather than but, we also have a Judaic gallery. And as I'll say in my lecture next week, because I'm competitive, we are the only museum in this country that does both. There are museums that have a gallery, not many. There are museums that integrate, like the Met in New York, but we're the only ones who do both, right? I think it's fair to say that. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. This was a really amazing, how much you succeeded in accomplishing in a short space of time was really astonishing. Appreciate it so much. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about changing ideas of what it means to be Jewish over this great sweep of history, and their relationship to Jewish literacies. I'm just wondering if this thesis of the ever-dying people has to do with the phenomenon of Jewish ethnicity in some ways in America and modernism replacing Jewish knowledge and Hebrew and practice, and if, this idea that American Jews eat bagels rather than can, have a language that they actually have or can open a page of Talmud.
I mean, it's interesting. I know of no moment in American Jewish history when Jews were unconcerned about what we would call continuity. Indeed, from the beginning, when some of the earliest Jews disappear, intermarry, and their descendants disappear, you see the concern. And one of the reasons I think there is continuity is that American Jews are so worried that unless things change, it'll, all be wiped out. There wasn't a sense that the government or your enemies would keep Judaism alive, and therefore you have this interesting paradox. Well, we have to change, otherwise our children won't be Jewish. And that's really, honestly, the Charleston reformers say that unless changes are made, the next generation will abandon. It's not unique to Judaism, but that is certainly there. I do think that the discussion of Jewish knowledge is a very important one. It's not thick. In the New World, the people who cared the most about Jewish learning didn't come to the New World. The people who came were the people who cared more about material wealth. And that's especially true in North America. In some of the Caribbean communities, you did have rabbis. I didn't mention it, but you really don't have an ordained rabbi until 1840, and we have some of his papers, and he wonders whether he made a huge mistake in coming to America. He even asked, can Jews live? Are they permitted to live in a country like that? That's Abraham Rice in 1840. One of the points that's not made often enough, though, is that, especially with the coming of East European immigrants, there is a tremendous transfer of Jewish culture, especially books, from Eastern Europe to America, between 1880 and 1940. Great Jewish libraries are created. The Jewish Theological Seminary, Hebrew Union College, the Library of Congress, the New York Public Library, and so on. We should remember that saved Jewish civilization. When the Nazis destroyed so many Jewish books and libraries, already that transfer had taken place to the United States, and America also was publishing quite a lot of books. An important Hebrew press had been set up, and there were smaller presses that could produce rabbinic works, and so America becomes culturally independent. It's not our subject today, but I've written about it, and I hope that more attention is paid to this astonishingly rapid transfer of culture from the old world to the new. I see a question.
We have time for one
over
more
there. No,
quick
I'm never going to be able to hear you. Wait
Yeah,
until
we
you
have
get-
time for one more quick question. We have just a few minutes left. I know you've been waiting very patiently.
Can you say something about the conservative movement in the United
Yes,
States?
that's a fair question. I didn't say anything about the conservative movement, and let me say that the conservative movement is usually dated now somewhere between the arrival of Solomon Schechter in 1902-3 and to there's a book by a student of mine who really makes the argument that the conservative movement was created by Schechter's disciples. Solomon Schechter never thought he was creating a movement. That's very American. Yes, Alexander Campbell, he called his, excuse me, his churches the Christian churches. He wanted to change everybody. Then it became the Campbellite churches. So was Schechter. Schechter called it conservative because it wasn't liberal. He wanted to create to bring together all the forces of tradition against reform. And he imagined an American Judaism that really had two groups. Everybody, like in England, where he lived before. Either you're a little liberal or a little conservative, as Gilbert and Sullivan put it. Hey, by the way, we may be moving in that direction, a kind of bipolar American Jewish community. So, but what happened was that traditionalists did not accept his brand of tradition, and during the interwar years, there are a series of small disputes over some issues that people couldn't understand, like the aguna, the anchored woman who couldn't remarry because her husband couldn't be found to give her a Jewish divorce. And then a lot of debates that people could understand, prayer book debates, debates over kosher food, and eventually, right after World War II, the conservative movement makes two very significant decisions. One, accepting the use of electricity on the Sabbath, and the second, allowing people to drive to synagogue on the Sabbath. And that kind of cemented the idea that the conservative, and they also published their own prayer book. When you publish your own prayer book, you become a movement. And that cemented the separate conservative movement. as many of you know, the conservative movement, which at one time was the largest Jewish religious movement in America, it grew much faster than any other between the war and was still the largest movement in the 1960s. By the 1990s, we already saw a decline, and today the conservative movement is the oldest and actually the smallest now. Orthodox is still smaller. But it's smaller than the Reform movement and not growing. So it's a reminder that in American religion, movements go up and down. Think of the Shakers, although for a different reason. But there are many other, even Unitarians, whom I mentioned before. John Adams thought we'd all be Unitarian. Didn't quite work out that way in Protestantism. That's conservative movement, but the conservative movement really tried to find a middle ground between tradition and change. It was great during the years when all Americans wanted to be in the middle, when President Eisenhower thought, that's where Americans of all kinds should be, and neither fascists nor communists. And the conservative movement was that golden mean. Today, in a polarized American culture, polarized left and right, it's much harder. And all of the centrist movements, think Episcopalianism, all of those movements have declined. And they've all declined about the same amount, suggesting that it's the culture that has been central and not something so peculiar to the conservative movement. Other?
And we're going to end it right here. Thank you so much for being
All
here
right, well,
today,
thank
and thank you
you.
so much, Jonathan.
Yeah.